following is a presentation of Danger Zone Productions.
Listen all you motherfuckers!
As far back as I can remember, the first actual exposure I ever had as a kid to an RPG-esque game was probably in the form of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. It came out in 1992, available on the Super Nintendo and, over in Japan of course, on the Super Famicom. To be honest, most people have mixed reactions about this game. Either some people say it's so bad it's good, or it's so good it's bad. And others just think it's, well, forgetful. To be honest, this was the first attempt by Square to try and, I guess, wander off the beaten path with their Final Fantasy games. Up to this point, the latest Final Fantasy games they'd had was all the way up to Final Fantasy V. And to be honest, it didn't really get much more basic as far as storytelling when it comes to Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. You got this hero of legend who's supposed to fulfill a prophecy to unlock 5 legendary crystals to keep evil from destroying the world.
Of course!
What's going on? You've just entered the Danger Zone, and I am Dangerous Danny South. And welcome to OMGRPG Numero 2. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. You know, just saying the name floods my memory with all kinds of memories of me and my brother sitting up at all hours of the night playing Super Nintendo, but more importantly, playing Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Like I said, it really was my first exposure to RPG games and video games. The story was about as cookie cutter as you could get, but then again, what Final Fantasy game isn't, really, when you think about it? So many memories. Of course, I was far too young back in those days to really appreciate things like storytelling and, you know, effects and all that bullshit. Which is why I felt that this was probably a perfect game to take a look at for this series, to find out if Mystic Quest was a gigantic triumph, or if it was a piece of that deserves to be forgotten in the annals of time. Let's not waste any time, let's take a look at this puppy.
As soon as the game boots up, you're basically plunged right into the nest of things, as it seems your main character's village is getting swallowed up by the earth or some bullshit like that, I don't know. Believe it or not, there actually is a default name for the main character, which you wouldn't know unless you read the manual. Hintity hint hint, I didn't. So basically you're left to pick whatever name you want. Oh, and if you're curious, the main character's name is Benjamin. Yeah, I know, what are the odds? Anyway, his village gets sucked up into the plot hole, and then he's basically said he's the hero of legend who's supposed to free the crystals and save the world. Like I said, pretty basic storytelling when it comes to this game. So okay, you gotta free the crystals. How do I do that? Well, you gotta go to a dungeon and you gotta set them free by, of course, defeating a boss. There's a crystal basically for each element, which of course means you gotta fight in an earth level, a water level, a fire level, and a wind level. About as generic as white bread, ain't it? Let's talk about the combat system. Combat is dealt with only 2 characters, as opposed to most traditional RPGs that let you play with 3. Unfortunately, also unlike most traditional RPGs where you get to choose which partners can travel with the main character, the storyline does this for you, having characters come in and out, in and out. Your partners range anywhere from a Earthchild redhead named Kaylee to a ninja who I honestly thought had a shell on his back at first named Tristan, to a red mage named Phoebe, and finally a warrior named Ruben. The combat's pretty straightforward in the traditional turn-based strategy type, basically ranging from anything from attack with your weapon to use magic. Some characters are more proficient with magic than others, and then there are also some characters who use items that require ammunition. Your character in particular does get a certain type of weapon in the form of explosives that require ammunition, but other than that, the only 2 that really require it is Tristan with his ninja stars and Phoebe with her arrows once she gets her bow. And speaking of weapons, your character actually gets to use 4 different types of weapons himself. You've got a sword-type weapon, an axe-type weapon, an explosive-type weapon, and a claw-type weapon, each one having their own unique abilities. You use the axe to chop things down, obviously. You use the claw to climb along things, kind of like Spider-Man. You use the bombs to blow open passageways and secrets, and you use the sword to poke things and open doors? Anyway, one of the more annoying aspects of the combat you're going to find is the status effects. These monsters will spam the ever-loving out of these status effects, and they will you over very easily by doing so. One of their favorite ways of doing this is petrifying your partner and then casting sleep and or confusion on you so that you're basically powerless while they rape you in the corner till you die. And they will do this a lot. Constantly, in fact.
Truth be told, 9 times out of 10, it probably will be the status effects that get you killed more than anything. The 3 worst ones, in my book at least, paralyze, petrify, and sleep. Yeah, we're dealing with a game where sleep is actually an issue. But that's not to say that the combat system is riddled with issues. It's really not. As long as you choose a proper strategy, getting through the encounters really isn't that much of a difficult thing to do. But making sure to get the proper things you need to get through these encounters, that can be. Naturally, you've got to find the spells throughout the game, and, well, this game does a pretty good job of hiding them. Probably the one that's the hardest and biggest pain in the ass to find is the life spell. Spoiler alert, by the way, if you're interested in playing the game. The life spell can be found in the volcano level. The only problem with that is the volcano level itself is so big and freaking huge that it'll take you forever to find it, and is probably the reason why a lot of people accidentally ended up skipping over the life spell. But the good news about it is the life spell is one of the few items in the game where you can actually go back and get it. Nothing really happens to the level to cause it to up, and therefore you can go back and get it. As opposed to getting the heal spell, which is at the falls basin. If you skip the heal spell and you beat the ice pyramid, water's flowing again, and guess what? You can kiss the heal spell goodbye. Little things like that you've got to keep an eye out for, because this game will take advantage of it.
And speaking of things that this game will take advantage of, one of the plus sides to it is that it eliminates the necessity of random encounters. That's all fine and dandy, until you realize that while it does kind of take the Chrono Trigger approach, being that you can actually see what enemies are coming, even though they don't move like they do in Chrono Trigger, this game takes the opportunity to put as many fights in your path as they possibly can. It turns what should be at least a half-hour trek through a dungeon into a 2-hour grind fest, fighting monsters in every shape and size at every twist and turn. There is a monster at every staircase. There is a monster at every ladder. There's a monster at every doorway. There are at least 5 monsters going down barely 2 feet of hallway. And then sometimes when you find one of the special chests that most likely contains a piece of armor, a key item, or a spell or whatever, they'll actually cluster about 6 or 7 of these encounters together into a nice big steaming pile of you soup, turns the whole thing into a endurance round just to take 2 steps. Another thing that you're probably going to catch on real quick in this game is just how lazy the designers were in creating monsters. I think it's probably around the water level that they just finally gave up on making new monsters and decided just to use palette swaps of previous monsters and call them something else. And if you don't know what a palette swap is, basically that's taking the same character model from a previous creature and just painting it a different color. They do this for every single creature, every monster, every mini-boss, even the main bosses at the end get transformed into palette swaps of their former selves. Yeah, at the very last dungeon of the game, you actually have to fight a palette swap of all 4 of the main bosses from the previous levels. You have to fight a palette swap of the bony dinosaur from the earth level. You have to fight a palette swap of the snow golem from the ice level. You have to fight a palette swap of the two-headed dragon from the fire level. And yes, you have to fight a palette swap of Pazuzu? So despite all that stuff, you guys are probably wondering, well, how does the game end? Well, you meet back up with a previous character, Phoebe, because apparently she's the only one bad enough to actually make it to the final boss, and you have to confront the Dark King in order to rescue the Crystal of Light. And get this, when you confront the Dark King, he tells you that the prophecy that your character was supposed to be the hero of the world was just a rumor that he made up.
Wasn't that a plot device they used in the Lego movie?
So now the fight is on as Benjamin and Phoebe square off against the Dark King, the master of the power of darkness. That's right, people. You're literally attacking the darkness. It's probably worth mentioning that this guy is annoying in his own right. In order to beat him, you actually have to defeat 4 different forms of him, the first of which really isn't much to deal with. Then he turns into this 6-armed guy, kind of resembling Goro from Mortal Kombat. Then he turns into a giant spider. And finally, into a tentacle monster. You know, looking at this thing, I feel like I should make some sort of tentacle porn joke, but honestly, I've got nothing. Anyway, you whoop his ass, and then he f***s off, and then this floating guy who's kind of been following you throughout the game shows up, and surprise, he turns into the Crystal of Light. And then you beat the game. The end.
So Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, you kind of got to take it for what it is. Either you liked it, or you didn't. Me personally, it'll always hold a very special place in my childhood, as the game that got me introduced into the wonderful world of RPG games. It's got fun and engaging characters, a simple battle system, and storyline that's easy to follow. And I think we can all agree that this game's got one of the most ballingest soundtracks I've ever heard out of a game from the early 90s. I'm serious. I don't think there's a single bit of background music that you won't have stuck in your head for a few days. Well, thanks you guys for joining me for part 2 of OMGRPG. Rest assured, part 3 will be on its way soon. Thanks for joining me. Until then, I'm Danny South, and if you don't know, now you know.